This is a pre-lab video for Lab 5 Neuroanatomy, Cerebral Neurovasculature. So in this lab we're going to be looking at the arteries of the brain and brainstem as well as the cranial nerves. So the first artery we're going to look at is going to be our vertebral artery. It's a branch off the subclavian artery. It's coming up through the neck along the anterior aspect of the spinal cord, as we see in this picture highlighted in green. The two vertebral arteries on either side are going to combine to form our basilar artery just in front of the pons. Off of the vertebral arteries, there's two branches we want to look at. We have first our anterior spinal artery. It's going to run along the ventral median fissure of the spinal cord. And the next is our posterior inferior cerebellar artery. Off of the posterior inferior cerebellar artery, we actually have a branch not shown in this picture. So to see that, we're going to switch to this one. So you can see here we have our vertebral arteries coming together to form our basilar artery here. We have the anterior spinal artery, and we have our posterior inferior cerebellar. Off that posterior inferior cerebellar artery, highlighted in green here, we have our posterior spinal artery. So it's going to be just like the anterior spinal artery, except there are two on the posterior aspect. So back to this picture, we have off of our basilar artery, there are three branches we're going to look at on either side. First is the anterior inferior cerebellar artery. It's going to be the first main branch off of the basilar artery. Second main branch off the basilar artery is going to be our superior cerebellar artery. And then the third branch is going to be the terminal branches of the basilar artery, and that is the posterior cerebral artery. So the posterior cerebral artery marks the beginning of what is known as the circle of Willis, which I will outline for you guys later. The next artery we're going to look at is going to be our posterior communicating artery. So we have two communicating arteries, an anterior and a posterior, and they are going to be connection points between two different arteries. Our posterior communicating artery is a connection between our posterior cerebral artery and our internal carotid artery. So I say connection point in to say that they do not directly supply any structures within the brain, but they just form that anastomosis between the two arteries. So our internal carotid artery is our next one, and that is coming from inferior, and it's going to meet up with that posterior communicating artery and then continue laterally until it terminally bifurcates into our anterior cerebral artery and our middle cerebral artery. The last artery that we're going to look at is going to be the anterior communicating artery. The anterior communicating artery connects our two anterior cerebral arteries together. So just like we had our posterior communicating artery connected the posterior cerebral and the internal carotid arteries, anterior communicating connects our left and right anterior cerebral arteries. So that completes actually our circle of Willis. So if you follow my mouse, we're going to come from basilar artery. When it splits, our circle of Willis starts with our posterior cerebral artery, comes up the posterior communicating artery to the internal carotid artery, from the internal carotid artery to the anterior cerebral artery, across the anterior communicating artery, and then back down the same structures on the other side to form that circle known as the circle of Willis. That's it for our blood vessels. Now we're going to look at the cranial nerves, and for the first two we're actually going to stay on the same picture. So our first nerve we're going to talk about is going to be our olfactory nerve. It's cranial nerve 1. So olfactory nerve is responsible for our sense of smell. It's going to be located on the inferior aspect of the cerebrum, as you can see here highlighted in green. The next nerve is cranial nerve 2, so our optic nerve. So the optic nerve, we have a right and a left optic nerve that combine here to form our optic chiasm. And posteriorly, the optic nerve continues, but it's then called the optic tract. So the optic nerve would technically be anterior to the optic chiasm. Optic tract would be posterior to the optic chiasm. For the rest of the cranial nerves, we're going to be looking at the brainstem and seeing where they come out of the brainstem. So we're going to start at the top with our oculomotor nerve coming out superior to the pons at the midline. And the oculomotor nerve is going to be responsible for movements of the eye. Another cranial nerve responsible for movements of the eye is our trochlear nerve, here, highlighted in green. And it actually comes out from the posterior aspect of the brainstem. It's coming out from between these ball-looking structures here. This is going to be our inferior colliculus and our superior colliculus here on either side. So our trochlear nerve is coming out between those inferior colliculi and continuing laterally and coursing around the anterior aspect of the brainstem, as you see here. Next, we're going to talk about the trigeminal nerve. Trigeminal nerve had a variety of functions as far as autonomics are involved, but it also is involved in sensory of the face. So majority of the sensation from the skin of the face comes from the trigeminal nerve. So trigeminal nerve, as you see here, is going to be significantly larger than our oculomotor nerve, and it's going to come out from within the pons on that lateral aspect. Our abducens nerve is the next nerve, cranial nerve 6, and it is going to be coming out between our pons and our medulla near midline. So it's going to be the most medial structure coming out between those two. Moving laterally, we're going to have 3 nerves that are grouped together in their origin points. The first of which is going to be the facial nerve, seen here. So facial nerve is primarily responsible for the movements of the face that allow for facial expression, and it's also responsible for taste in the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. Slightly lateral to our facial nerve, we're going to have our vestibulocochlear nerve. The vestibulocochlear nerve is going to be responsible for our sense of hearing and our sense of balance. Slightly inferior to our vestibulocochlear nerve in this picture, we're going to find our glossopharyngeal nerve. So glossopharyngeal nerve also had several functions, including the sensation for the oropharynx and taste in the posterior third of the tongue. Next is going to be our vagus nerve. So vagus nerve is responsible for a significant amount of function, especially in the parasympathetic system, but is also motor for the muscles of the pharynx. So in this picture, we're seeing our vagus nerve is coming out lateral to what's known as our medullary olive. You can see that here. So we have our medullary pyramids midline with our anterior median fissure here. And then lateral to our medullary pyramids, we have our medullary olive. So our vagus nerve actually comes out lateral to that medullary olive, and that's going to separate it from our hypoglossal, which we'll talk about in a minute. The next nerve we're going to talk about is going to be found actually in the cervical spine, not actually coming off of the brainstem, and that's our accessory nerve, which we learned about in Gross, and that it is responsible for the movements of the sternocleidomastoid and the trapezius muscles. So that's actually branching off of the cervical spine, not truly off of the brainstem. Our last nerve we're going to talk about is the hypoglossal nerve. So the hypoglossal nerve, seen here highlighted in green, is coming out between our medullary pyramids and our medullary olive. So our vagus nerve is lateral to that olive, but our hypoglossal nerve is actually medial to the medullary olive. And as far as the function of the hypoglossal nerve, it's responsible for the movements of the tongue.